to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to take a look at an organization that touches all of our lives virtually every day, and that's the United Nations. My guest is an expert on the UN. Alynna Lyon is a professor of political science at the University of New Hampshire, and she is the co-editor and chief of the journal Global Governance. She is the author of U.S. Politics and the United Nations, A Tale of Dysfunctional Dynamics. Dr. Alynna Lyon, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Bill, thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. We're going to get into your interesting book and a new book that just literally is hot off the press to some degree. But let's talk just very briefly, talk about the historical overview of the role of the League of Nations and the role of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the creation of the United Nations. When this was all before, obviously, the UN came online on June 26, 1945. But just give a little historical background on that, if you would, please.
Sure. So both the League of Nations, which was Woodrow Wilson's idea after World War I, and the United Nations, which was really the brainchild of several people, but definitely Franklin Delano Roosevelt was front and center of that particular, were basically American ideas about how do we prevent war, right? So after World War I, after World War II, there was this real push to, we need to do something to not have 70 million people die like this again. And so what you see with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and it's, we had just mentioned that we could do an entire show on this, it's absolutely fascinating. Because the League of Nations domestically within the United States had been rejected by what I call sovereigntists, people said, no, we're afraid of this. It might take away from U.S. power to act independently. He was very instrumental in wooing very quietly support for the United Nations, and through his fireside chats that many of your audience will be aware of, but also making sure it wasn't politicized. He made sure that the United Nations was a bipartisan project, right? And so when he was putting together these conferences and they were designing it, he had Republicans and Democrats on the team. And in fact, in the vote to approve the San Francisco Charter, which is the thing that creates the UN, it's a treaty, the US Senate voted 89-2. So there was significant support, which is really different than you see for the League of Nations.
It certainly was. It certainly is. And of course, the United Nations was created in 1945 to eliminate the scourge of war, to promote economic and social development, and to enhance human rights. And we've seen that the issues that are on the docket, if you will, or on the agenda at the United Nations today are far broader than what the founders had ever thought. They were not talking about climate change. They weren't talking about polio. They weren't talking about pandemics and those types of things. But the mandate has expanded and the role of the UN has become much more important. But as a member state, say for the United States, what are the advantages and maybe what are some of the disadvantages of being a member of the United Nations?
Well, it's a really great question. And I think it's a different answer depending on what kind of country you are. If you're a small country, it provides access. It's one of the only places you can do diplomacy. The entire world is there. It's easy to go down the hall and talk to an ambassador from another country. That applies to the United States. But in the United States' case, it actually has enhanced and exceptional benefits from the United Nations. For one, it really is a bedrock of our ideals, right? So it is a place where we vote. It's very democratic in its processes, but we'll put the Security Council to the side. But even Security Council, where the United States has veto power, which means if it doesn't like anything, it can kill it, right? So if the UN decides to do any of these peace and security pieces, the US can end it immediately. But also, the entire world comes to New York. It's very Western, it's very American. You know, they're voting, they're in suits, they're in ties, that there's a cultural power that the United States has there. There's also an economic advantage in, for example, the ability to burden share. So take the 1991 Persian Gulf War. In the 1991 Persian Gulf War, the United States went to the UN under the George H.W. Bush administration, got support from the UN Security Council, and basically distributed the cost. So the United States paid about 12% of the costs of the Persian Gulf War because the allies, through the United Nations, pitched in the rest. So there's economic, and what we call normative, meaning you can set the agenda, you can set the ideas. Gillian Sorensen once said, the United Nations presents a wonderful opportunity for the United States to lead.
It certainly does. And it has been pointed out over the years that so often many people, many Americans, we have so many myths, and we'll get into some of them in a minute, about the United Nations. But basically, when you look at the whole UN system, and I'm talking about across the board, specialized agencies, looking at the Civil Aviation Organization, the World Meteorological Organization, peacekeeping, those types of things, that the United States actually benefits from the foreign policy standpoint, but also financially. Just the fact that the UN is in New York, it was reported years ago, and this has probably gone up, maybe pre-COVID, but the city of New York alone made over $3.5 billion just from the UN being there, with the restaurants, with the diplomats coming in, using hotel rooms, things like that. So when you look at the whole system, given that the US, we have like 40%, 45% of the international aircraft. We depend upon the International Civil Aviation Organization, but the US actually earns money off of the United Nations, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a big bang for a little buck. I mean, the United States, it's funny when you talk about myths and misperceptions, there is a significant misperception among at least the American electorate that we pay an enormous amount of money to the United Nations. And it's actually less, I think it's less than 0.01% of our foreign policy budget. And when you think about the entire UN budget, it's about 12 billion. Now, I haven't looked at this year's numbers, but I live in New Hampshire. New Hampshire has no state income tax and no sales tax. And that's about the same as the operating budget of the state of New Hampshire, which is a tiny state. So, and yes, the United States does play a significant portion of their dues and of peacekeeping, but at the same time, it's tiny money when we're talking about kind of the bang that they get for their buck in terms of the resources, whether or not it's things like the Universal Postal Union, right? That in itself, global commerce would shut down if you didn't have those postal regulations at the global level.
Exactly. And you were talking about the peacekeeping operations and peacekeeping expenses. The U.S. Government Accountability Office years ago did a study saying that it was 8 times cheaper to have a UN mission involved in a peacekeeping operation when it can handle it. Now, in some cases, the UN can't handle it for whatever reason, but when they can do it, it's 8 times cheaper than to have the US military. And oh, by the way, when you have peacekeepers from Bangladesh, India, or wherever, you don't have US soldiers on the front lines, which is a great interest to Americans, at least the ones with whom I've spoken in the past. So there are many advantages, and of course there are some limitations too as we go through this. Well, let's talk a bit about, we can intersperse all of these different ideas as we go, but in your book, in the book that I mentioned in the introduction, we said about the U.S. politics and the United Nations, the Tale of Dysfunctional Dynamics. What did you focus on in that book? And let's bring it up to maybe the last 4 or 5 administrations in the United States government to see how they dealt with the United Nations.
Yeah, so Bill, when I mentioned earlier, when the UN is created, it's a US-based invention, right, with enormous bipartisan support. So the thing that was so fascinating to me is what I see as the waxing and waning of how the US engages at the United Nations. And, there's a scholar who talked about this, Edward Luck, of mixed messages. That the United States seems hot and cold and hot and cold. And so I wanted to look like, what is driving this? And how did the UN kind of fall out of favor? Because you actually have seen what I call bipartisan bashing. You've seen whether or not it's the Clinton administration or the George W. Bush administration, even, Obama, who claimed to be a multilateralist, someone who likes working with other countries. There was times when he talked about the failures of the UN, and absolutely legitimate, but, what was driving that? And so one of the pieces is really kind of orientation. Are these presidents and their administrations multilaterals? Do they see their role globally as working with partners, bringing in allies, and is the UN the appropriate place to do that? Or are they kind of a go it alone, somebody labeled it cowboy diplomacy, right? That you're kind of out there in the world, guns a-blazing. And it's funny because one would think, well, the Republicans are on one side and Democrats are on the other side, or conservatives and liberals or globalists. And it's not as cut and dry as one would like to think. So for example, George H.W. Bush, the 41st president, was a strong multilateralist. He had actually served as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, U.S. ambassador to China. I mean, he'd had all these experiences where he thought that this is a very valuable thing, and thus, like the numbers that I quoted earlier, when he did, when the move was made to go into Iraq in 1991, he said, let's do this as a team through the United Nations. Let's be multilateralists. But it's interesting because even, for example, Bill Clinton claimed to be multilateralist, right? I want to work with partners, and the UN is the appropriate place. And yet, there are times in which the Clinton administration avoids kind of the norms and the ideals of the UN, for example, in Rwanda, not wanting to commit resources and troops, enhance the peacekeeping operation, actually shut down the peacekeeping operation in '94 in Rwanda. You also see the Clinton administration sidestepping the UN in Kosovo in 1999, but multilateral, meaning that the Clinton administration still wanted to be with partners through NATO, but not through the UN. And that's partly because Russia was blocking, right? So, and different presidents have come against different circumstances. So it's not only about their own ideology, what they care about, what their priorities are, how they want to go about, but sometimes it's about what's going on at the UN. So for example, the Biden administration, because of the situation in Ukraine, is Russian imposed. It's almost impossible to do anything in Security Council. So sometimes it's about an ideology, sometimes it's a pragmatic approach like the George H.W. Bush administration, or sometimes it's kind of the politics in the UN aren't right for working within that venue.
It certainly is. And they've been all over the map at times as far as supporting or not supporting, being involved. It's almost, they're schizophrenic at times. Well, the one big, I'm not going to say the biggest, well, maybe one of the biggest events that ever took place at the United Nations was in 2003, when George W. Bush basically violated the UN Security Council's resolutions and launched an illegal war in Iraq. How did that develop, and what have been the implications of that over the past several years? It was not just a one-time event and everybody went home, but that really was earth-shattering, and many the political scientists say that was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, blunder in U.S. history.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So the United States was quite convinced, at least their intelligence was indicating, that there are weapons of mass destruction. And of course, the UN Security Council is supposed to deal with threats to international peace and security. The Bush administration goes to the Security Council, presents what it had with evidence. And I've actually interviewed for the book, the Germans were actually sitting on Security Council, and I've interviewed people in the Foreign Ministry office and the French as well. And both Germany and France said they just weren't convinced by the evidence. There just wasn't evidence that that was there and that they couldn't support. And actually someone from one of my interviews with the French said they actually thought about voting for the resolution to save the UN because it was going to put such a damper, such a black mark, both on the United States, but also looking like the UN couldn't control what looked like an aggressive maneuver on the part of a superpower. The kind of fallout from that, and this is really interesting, so, and it was one of the things you mentioned about people not really understanding. The Bush administration at that moment in March of 2003 was very critical of the UN, calling it irrelevant, saying we don't care about it, we don't need it. And yet, one of the things that's so interesting when you follow the money, if you will, you see the Bush administration quietly returning in about 2005, realizing that the UN would be very helpful in the rebuilding of post-war Iraq. And so you actually see a quadrupling of money, of voluntary contributions on the part of the Bush administration to UN peacekeeping, which was exactly quietly, we're going to go in and help them support us in the post-conflict situation within Iraq.
Many U.S. presidents, both Democratic and Republican, have attacked the United Nations, sometimes factually, actually, most of the time wrongly, to be quite honest, but inevitably they always come back to the United Nations because they realize you have to have an international forum that brings the countries of the world together to deal with these problems. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with the PBS or community access television station, or you have an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a podcast, or just a computer and you like our shows, and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking about really the number one international institution, and that is the United Nations. Dr. Alynna Lyon is a professor of political science at the University of New Hampshire. She is also the co-editor and chief of the journal Global Governance. She's the author of U.S. Politics and the United Nations, A Tale of Dysfunctional Dynamics. Let's just take these last two administrations, Trump administration, the Biden administration, and to sort of compare them to see how they're dealing with the UN. Now, if we think back to Donald Trump, well, first of all, how would you describe his foreign policy approach as opposed to Joe Biden's?
Yeah, so for one, the Trump administration and President Trump himself are quite exceptional in that when I compare across administrations, I like to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. So I often am, comparing Republicans to Republicans and Democrats to Democrats, right, just to see their particular orientation. And the Trump administration is exceptional in several things. One, you see a rejection of what he called globalism. He liked the forum. President Trump himself liked the forum, kind of like the pomp and circumstances of opening ceremonies in September and going and making those speeches. But at the same time, the rhetoric was always very damning of the UN. He'd call it kind of a social group, a group of people partying, and it's irrelevant and things like that. But more importantly than the rhetoric, although the rhetoric does have a significant impact on public opinion domestically, was the funding and support for UN agencies. So there's some things that the Trump administration did that we haven't seen before. There's some things that are consistent with previous Republican administrations. So for example, withdraw from the Human Rights Council, withdraw from UN AIDS and cutting funding from UN AIDS, withdraw from the World Health Organization, cutting all funding to UNICEF, cutting all funding to UNRWA, which is the Palestinian Relief Organization, blocking funding to the Office for High Commissioner for Refugees and Human Rights. There are all these different places that were quite consistently aggressive in either withdrawing the US's membership or blocking funding. The other thing that's really interesting is the kind of the turnover. When I look and I try to measure, I have kind of these measurements, if you will, of administrations. One is, do you promote the US ambassador to the UN as a member of your cabinet? So the Trump administration demotes it. So Nikki Haley was not a member of the cabinet, which means they're not in the inside looking at things in Washington, D.C., whereas Biden promoted his to a cabinet level position, right? So that in itself tells you right then. And then when Nikki Haley resigned as US ambassador to the United Nations, it took 9 months for the Trump administration to fill that position. So that tends to speak to the priority that the Trump administration had for the UN, right? If you don't fill the office, then there was an interim person obviously representing the United States, but not a priority. And so, in the Biden administration, the rhetoric has been probably, and this is actually coming out just in the last couple months, as pro-multilateralism, as we've seen, pro-democracy, pro-multilateralism. And part of that is pre-Ukraine, where the Biden administration says we want organizations around democracy. So kind of thinking about the UN as an organization where democracies can come together. And then also, of course, with Ukraine, it's in our strategic interest to rally as many countries as possible around the condemnation of Russia for its invasion and the gathering of resources for refugees, the collection of data for human rights violations, which lots of agencies within the UN are actually doing. So these are really polar opposite, right? And one other point that I think is really interesting is that the Trump administration is unusual and that Trump really kind of personalized his own relationship with the UN. So if I like the UN and people at the UN like me, then maybe I'll work there. But if you don't like me, I'm not going to like you, which we've never seen a president kind of make world politics and foreign policy about their own personal relationship with world leaders.
And the rule of thumb is that if you're not in the game, you're sitting on the bench. If you're sitting on the bench, you're not setting the agenda, you're not involved in the discussion. So the withdrawal from the Human Rights Council was detrimental to the United States. Two others withdrawals that we haven't mentioned yet that were absolutely disastrous. One was withdrawing from WHO, the World Health Organization, especially during a time of a pandemic. You can maybe make an argument a little bit, not much, at some other time. It's certainly not during COVID-19 pandemic that's just ravaging the world. The other was the withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear deal, and that was cracked by the UN Security Council, the permanent 5 members, the US, Russia, the UK, France, and China, and Germany. They were involved in that. But that withdrawal really set in motion the Iranians to move back towards accumulating nuclear materials to make a nuclear weapon. And if they got a nuclear weapon, literally, it would just be an absolute disaster for what's going on in the Middle East. That leads to one question that I would like to ask that I've thought about. Even though it was a disastrous mistake by Donald Trump to do this, it was on behalf of the United States that we withdrew from that nuclear agreement. The US broke the deal. The Iranians were actually abiding by it. They were not building up their nuclear facilities. Does the United States, the Biden administration, not have a responsibility to get back into that deal any way, shape, or form they can do it within reason? They have dawdled on this, it seems like, and they are not moving forward. And now we see where the Iranians are just about at the point of having nuclear capabilities.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting point, both about the World Health Organization and about the Iranian nuclear deal. Someone said in terms of the World Health Organization, yes, there are problems with the World Health Organization. And but it was the Trump administration, it was a bit like firing the fire department in the middle of a fire, right? You don't like dismiss them in the middle of it.
Exactly.
And your point is really important here about creating a vacuum. So the United States accused the World Health Organization of being too close to China and being too driven by China's agenda, withdraws, and China comes along and says, well, we'll give you more money. So there's
right into China's hands.
Absolutely.
Right into their hands.
Absolutely. And it's not only with World Health Organization, but there's lots of Human Rights Council, right? So the US withdraws, then China comes in and says, oh, well, we get to set standards for human rights. And I'm not quite sure you want the Chinese driving that particular bus. So that's a really important point there. In terms of the Iranian nuclear agreement, 2 points. One, absolutely, it's a multilateral treaty that the US had signed with all sorts of other countries. The Iranians were in compliance, as were the other countries. The United States is the one that violates the treaty, right? This multilateral agreement. It's the one, and there are consequences beyond just Iran. There are consequences about what we call soft power or US credibility. It's very hard to do business if people don't believe that you're going to follow through. And it's the same type of thing with the Paris Climate Agreement, that the US signs this under the Obama administration, the Trump administration withdraws, then the Biden administration is back. I mean, just in terms of business, diplomacy, whatever you're doing, your personal friend, if they say they're going to be there and they show up half the time, I'm not quite sure you're going to want to do business with them going forward. So there's a real credibility issue that gets created between that hot and cold, which I think is, one of the things that I was looking at specifically to the Iranian nuclear deal. One of the problems with that is that during the Obama administration, when they were originally negotiating, the US had leverage. We had things that Iran wanted. They came into compliance, they came into this, we released that leverage, right? So we got them to the negotiating table, we got them to agree to the terms of inspections and taking their nuclear enrichment devices offline. We don't have the leverage that we have, we gave it up. And so the Biden administration, you're absolutely right, we need to get back into this, controlling this, but we don't quite have the leverage and the credibility thanks to the hot and cold in and out that we've seen regarding that issue.
It certainly has been hot and cold, up and down, that's for sure. Well, we have 30 seconds left. Unfortunately, we have a whole list of topics, but what have we missed up to this point that you'd like to summarize in 30 seconds as to how we should think about the UN?
Well, I just say that the UN is an absolutely essential organization. You could not rebuild it given the political will at this particular time. And, we think about 1945 and now we think about today, it is more relevant. It is more necessary because so many issues, whether it's climate change or global pandemics, global economic recession potentials, those are all things that multiple partners need to work through. And the UN provides that venue, right? It's an arena for countries to come and do that work there if they want to. There is nothing like that in terms of universal membership and the scope that is so broad that allows that space for countries to collaborate.
Well, Dr. Alynna Lyon, the polls show that the majority of the American public supports the United Nations, generally, depending upon the issue. But the polls also show we do not understand the United Nations. We really have a responsibility to learn more about the United Nations. And one way to do that, we talk about myths, is to get away from right-wing talk radio, get away from stations, operations that don't cover the UN very well, very factually, like a Fox or One American News or Newsmax, and to actually reach out to get some information, because we could not survive in this world today. And if we had more time today, we could talk about how maybe the UN over the years has really helped us to avert World War III and make maybe nuclear annihilation. But Dr. Lyon, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.